solution to the problem. Being risk averse is something that is kind of being taught in a different way. You should be that person always willing to go out, try new things. Don't be afraid to challenge yourself.
Welcome back to Leaders Recon. I'm your host, Captain Carney, and today we're interviewing Colonel Williams, Chief of the Joint Plans Division within the J5. Ma'am, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're discussing interagency relationships, and the first question that I'd like to open with is, what is the, with all of your experience, best DomOps memory that you have?
So actually the best DomOps experience I had was actually when I was a member of the Texas National Guard. We actually did hurricane response for Hurricane Ike and Gustav. And one of the big key takeaways were I got to really learn to work with the regional FEMA office and also the regional and the state emergency management office. And through that engagement, we kind of shared TTPs on what capabilities the National Guard brought to homeland response and also what in return we would get from our state emergency responses.
So each time you have a disaster or something like that, what's the learning curve like? Is there always like a reintegration of or refamiliarization at the start?
So actually, no, a little less than what you would probably actually believe. The states that are very common and really prone to the same type of domestic response, wildland fires, hurricanes, tornadoes, those states are very well trained and well rehearsed on what requirements. And they've also spent the time building and strengthening those relationships with their local and regional first responders. So the learning curve for them is very, very slim. It's the states where you may not typically be approached to do domestic response operation that there is sometimes a learning curve, because if you're not used to working with FEMA and how the national response framework works, then you do have to introduce yourself, learn the process, learn who your counterparts are, and what is expected of you being in that role.
So in our previous podcasts in the DomOps series, we spoke with Colonel Kudemeyer on the role of the Guard within DomOps domestic operations. And then in the second episode, we talked with Colonel Soria about training and preparation for domestic operations. So with that in mind, since we're talking about interagency relationships, who are those entities that we normally work with as the Guard?
So at NGB, a lot of our partners are the big agencies. So we work with Department of Homeland Security. We work with FEMA, of course. We also work with Department of Transportation, Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and also some of our NGOs, American Red Cross. We work Salvation Army. So those are some of the big strategic level relationships that we work to strengthen here at NGB headquarters. But at some of the states on your local level, they're also working with their emergency operations centers that are sometimes co-located with the states, but in other times they may not be. And one of the really big relationships that we recently are now starting to advocate for is the Business Emergency Management Operations Center. So on the business side of the house, that's where we tie in our public and our private partners. Organizations such as Walmart that really want to provide service to not only the community that is impacted, but also the first responders, the soldiers who are actually on site providing that service to the community. So we pull in our private partners so that we're not only taking care of the community, but also the soldiers that are actually serving that community.
With the Guard having such a unique relationship with each of its states and NGB being the liaison between HQDA, what does the Guard have as far as posturing to work with civil authorities?
So one of our biggest selling point, and it's referenced by all of our senior leaders, that the National Guard, we are true citizen soldiers. So we are located in every single zip code across the United States of America. So our soldiers are actually living in the community that they're out there trying to support and help. So we understand what is the basic needs of that community. We understand who are our first responders. We've built relationships because 9 times out of 10, the National Guard members are also members of the local fire department, the local police department. They're working in your hospitals. They're working in the stores in that community. So they have the same concerns that the average citizen living in those communities that are impacted will also have. So that is one of our greatest assets and tools. And then the second thing that we also bring to the fight is that we are getting specific military training that we get through our MOS specialty training, that we get through our basic leadership course that help us learn to lead and govern in those type of scenarios. So we learn to be resilient, we learn to be adaptable, we learn to be agile so that we can be calm, cool, and collective, be that reassuring force that when we show up on the scene, the community are a little more at ease because they understand the level of expertise that is coming to the response.
Whenever the National Guard is interacting with civil authorities and municipalities, cities, things like that, other organizations, what sort of command and control structure do we have? Do we ever take the lead on operations like that?
So, 100% of the time, we do not. We fall into the National Response Framework, which is an established process on how the chain of command works. So, although we may be the first on the scene, we would serve as the incident site commander until a local responder comes on the scene and then they would take over that role. So we always align and we always adhere to the National Response Framework, which is the biggest takeaway. So if you're not familiar with that process, you can easily learn about it through FEMA. They have a lot of online courses that explain to you how the National Response Framework works and how and where you fit into that whole process.
Whether you're at various echelons or,
Mm-hmm.
okay. So you were saying that there isn't much of a learning curve. So whenever these organizations are interacting with the Guard, they are, what sort of familiarity do they come to the operation with? Like, how intimate are they with our capabilities?
So most of the agencies really do understand what DoD brings to the fight or brings to the situation. So they are aware of all of the unique capabilities that we have. But what we do in the National Guard, we really try to highlight what are those really unique Guard specific missions that our civilian agencies may not be privileged or have access to that equipment to do. So we have a lot of the high trucks that we can use for high water rescue. We have a lot of aerial surveillance equipment that we can use to do site surveys. We also have specialty skill sets. We have a lot of medical support staff. So our civilian counterparts are aware of all of the specialty equipment that we have. But we're also who they go to rely on because of also the leadership that we bring and the level of experience and expertise. So it's also a level of calm and assurance that if we rely on DoD, we know that we're getting a certain level of professionalism that's going to come with that capability that we're receiving. So,
Yes, ma'am. So if a particular region has a need for a domestic operation and a particular state may not have, a nearby transportation company, is there interstate partnership amongst the guards coordinated by NGB, or how would a multi-state disaster look?
so all of the states have an EMAC agreement, which that EMAC agreement is already pre-planned and pre-established. And so on that EMAC agreement, the states already know that if there was an incident within their state, if their resources are overwhelmed, they already know who is next in line that can provide them with the capability. But another thing that we do at NGB to facilitate some of that crosstalk is that we pre-plan and we start looking out 5-10 days out beyond the current situation. Feel like, hey, Texas may overrun their internal capacity within a couple of hours. So what state nearby has the resources that can go back and support, or even when it's time to kind of rotate personnel out because you get soldier fatigue. So you want to make sure you have resources readily available, and we do that through the EMAC agreements.
And forgive me, ma'am, what does EMAC stand for?
So EMAC is Emergency Management Assistance Compact. So they're just written agreements that identify resource and capabilities requirements that states have that they can use during any type of domestic incident.
Okay, excellent. And so, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask more about your own experience with domestic operations. So, with that, what roles have you had, and over the years, how have those roles changed your perspective with domestic operations?
That is an excellent question. So I can actually date back to my time on active duty, and this is when I first started to develop a huge appreciation for the role that the National Guard plays in domestic response. When I was a captain on active duty, it was Hurricane Katrina, and I was stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, and we were getting ready for the fallouts that were coming to hit Texas side. And as we were preparing, packing up, loading up trucks to go down south to provide assistance, Texas National Guard called and said, "We got it. We have planned, trained, and prepared for hurricane response, and so we do not require Title X assistance for this response activity." So that was my first encounter. From the active duty side of the house, we really don't train for domestic response operations, so I was really unsure what I was going to be doing when I got on the fight, but we were being planned to prepare for arrival of distinguished visitors that will come out to tour the site. My second encounter was while I was with the Texas National Guard, and at that point I was on a brigade staff and I was working personnel requirements. And so at that point we were deploying resource and assets based on what FEMA was saying they were needed. So we were coordinate for food pickup locations, water transport sites. If we needed to plan emergency evacuations, we would make sure that we had the personnel accounted for that would go out, come back in, so that I was reporting the day-to-day requirements and capturing those. So that was a incident at the local level. Since I've been at the strategic level, most of my engagement is working with the FEMA headquarters. So doing huge incident responses, like when we had Hurricane Ida last year, we had an L&O embedded at FEMA headquarters staff. We also participated in their daily operational sync meetings so that we're getting information from FEMA and the regions as to what type of assets they're going to need. We also internally work with NGB to identify what are going to be the state's immediate requirements, how are we going to address those immediate requirements, but also looking out the second and third order effects. When do we need to prepare to have additional assets going out to that site? And also at the NGB staff, me being in the J5, we're also not only looking at the current incident that's going on, but all of the other domestic response. So we may be having a hurricane in Florida. We might be fighting wildfires in California. We may be responding to civil disturbances. So on the J5, we're working to plan out all those requirements. We're syncing with FEMA to make sure that we're integrated in their planning process, because they are also working the same activity that we're working. So at the really high strategic level, we're pre-planning for the fallout while we're also trying to plan response for the current events.
So with all the joint planning that happens with NGB, does FEMA identify a problem set and then they assume that the Guard will allocate resources to it? Or is there a partnership request process, something like that? What's that relationship with the allocation of resources?
So the way the allocation of resources work, FEMA basically has to build a mission assignment package. And they staff that request through the Office of the Secretary of Defense to get SecDef, Secretary of Defense approval. And then once that approval is gained, then the states are able to support that mission. Usually 9 times out of 10, states are already on state active duty supporting those mission sets, but through FEMA, it's actually an official request for additional support. And through those FEMA mission asset requests, it could be something as simple as needing aviation support to get in meal logistic packages to the area that's impacted, or trying to get use trucks to kind of drive supplies from point A to point B. But those have to be formally staffed and formally approved.
And those are SAD missions, right? State active duty?
They're only state active duty
Temporarily.
right, because once FEMA put in their official request, then the type of mission transitioned from a state active duty to a Title 32.
With all the experience and interactions that the Guard has had during its time, what sort of success have you seen or would you like to highlight about how the Guard can be successful with domestic operations?
So one of the big lessons learned that I would always stress to the states and to any personnel responding to domestic operations is building relationships is key. One of the sayings that we always use, it's better to show up to an incident and people say, "How have you doing?" than to say, "Who are you?" Because when they have to find out who you are, then you've already kind of starting at a disadvantage. So when you make those routine interactions with your state and local counterparts, you start to build those relationships. They learn what you bring to the fight. You learn what the agency brings to the fight, and it takes away a lot of the unknowns because you've already built and solidified a strong relationship so that when a domestic situation should arise, you already know your left and right limits because you've established that strong foundation. And then a second thing that I would always stress is to document your lessons learned because we're always looking to better ourselves and to better the response in the situation. So if you're actually taking an active role in documenting some of those things that you did well, things that you didn't do so well that you want to improve on, and those should not just be done in a vacuum. You should reach out to your state, your FEMA counterpart, your regional first responders, your Department of Transportation, some of those agencies that you may not think you need to work with. But if you reach out to them, they can also shed light on some things that, hey, they wish you being in the National Guard would have brought up so that they would have had a little more lesson learned. Because one of my previous incidents of working with a local responder, we made them quick little cheat sheets on what was the capability of certain military equipment. And when they got that reference document, they was like, "Oh my God, this is wonderful. Did not even know that you had this type of access at your disposal." And so just sharing simple things with your local community, it helps add huge value to the response operation.
So with having to maintain and the necessity to maintain those relationships, LNOs have to be very important, I would assume.
Very important.
So with the LNOs, where are they usually located? Which organizations? What are the roles they usually play? And how do Guard units stay in good communication with them?
So at the strategic level, we have LNOs embedded at the Department of Homeland Security and at FEMA on a regular basis. So at any given day, I can reach out to our LNO at FEMA and say, "Hey, what are you seeing on the horizon?" At the local level, typically those LNOs really aren't embedded with the emergency responders until the incident goes live. So unfortunately, you're building those relationships on the spot. However, typically in the states, you don't have as much turnover as you do at the strategic level. So the states have a more enduring partnership that they build with the agencies. And one of the other big advantages that a lot of the emergency operations centers are co-located with the Joint Force Headquarters. So the people that work in those offices, you see them day in and day out. And some of them, because of the dual role that a lot of our citizen soldiers serve, some of them on their civilian side of the house work in the emergency management office. So they're dual headed to support both the state and they can come and support on the federal side of the house. So they can serve dual roles, which is an easy way to get that internal LNO built into the system.
Is that so? The dual-hattedness of that, is that a best practice? Is that something that is sort of predefined whenever you step into a role oftentimes, or?
So at the smaller level, it's not always dual hatted, but like with some of the tags, so we have 33 tags that serve as both the tag of the state and they're also the head of the emergency management for that state. So those tags have that inherently built in role so that they're serving two functions. So that gives them keen eyesight into what are the state's emergency management requirements.
So whenever we talk about people being dual status like the tag, it also makes me think of dual status commanders. So in a sense of domestic operations, what is a dual status commander? What's their purpose? When do we use them?
So, a dual status commander is basically a general officer that has been identified to oversee a group of military members, service members that are coming from all compos. So, you have, it could be a National Guard officer, it could be an Army Reserve officer, or it could be an active duty officer. But that officer is in charge of that military force structure so that they can exercise command and control over a Title 10 as well as a Title 32 soldier at the same time. And they're only identified for those large scale exercises that will require cross compo support.
Okay. And this is a temporary thing, or it's just for the duration of an operation or disaster?
Right, so it's just a temporary mission that usually they're appointed by a combatant commander that's identified the need. And once the need is identified, you go through all of the approval processes to get a person identified and selected and moved into those positions.
So with all of the interagency relationships that we're fostering, we are implementing, we're maintaining, what I'd like to speak about the legal aspect. So with our JAG, what do our JAG officers do in relation to domestic operations?
So our JAG officers really just make sure that the National Guard is operating within the letters of the law. So they're making sure that all of the proper authorities are in place for any type of domestic response that we do. And also, like, for example, when DC Police Department, if they're overrun, they can deputize National Guard soldiers to kind of support their mission. So legal will review the paperwork to make sure that we are operating within the confines of the law and that we're not doing anything outside of what we are being deputized to do.
So with us operating with the other agencies, what sort of counsel do they bring to the table? Do we interact with other organization legal entities?
Not to my knowledge, because we rely heavily on whatever our internal legal support staff comes out with their final verdict.
Okay, so not a huge element. So with legal being on the mind, what sort of advice would you offer to commanders who are on the ground during disasters in a legal sense? Like if they need to work with JAG or something?
Always listen to your JAG officer.
Okay.
That's the number one thing for any commander, because your legal advisors are there just to do exactly that. They are to advise you. They're not telling you what to do. They're giving you sound counsel, sound advice on what are your left and right limits so that you have a clear boundary and you are operating within that boundary, because their role is to make sure that you're protected and that you're able to execute your mission and without having to suffer any type of repercussions.
So whenever it comes to, if I was in a state or I was in charge of a state or I was a leader in a state and I wanted to get involved with fostering the communication and the relationship with those other agencies, what could I do? What avenues can I take?
So one of the easiest ways to build those relationships at the local, regional level is to get involved in tabletop exercises. So across the 10 FEMA regions, we always host some type of tabletop exercise where we're looking at hurricane response, natural disaster response, nuclear detonation response. We try to make sure that the local community is prepared for any type of incident that can impact their area. And whenever we come out with the FEMA regional offices, the Department of Transportation, all of those regional first responders, and even those city and local responders, we always try to bring in the state National Guard. So states can get involved by participating in those tabletop exercises.
Okay.
And that's the first place they can start to build those relationships.
How often are they held?
They're held annually and they rotate across the region. When we get them, we definitely work with Colonel Soria and her office to make sure that we pull the states into them. So we always try to advertise well in advance to give the states time to prepare.
Okay. So in a more frequent than annual basis, what's a communication best practice? A commander would go through JFHQ or through the state, or how would they get in communication with those agencies to go beyond the annual basis of a TTX, tabletop exercise?
So you will work with your local emergency management office and through your Joint Force headquarters. They would be the first start to, if you wanted to kind of start building out, what are those plans, what are those requirements that we need to kind of start building our own rehearsals to make sure that we're prepared for anything that would happen to our area.
So in addition for leaders to communicate with their state and attending TTXs, are there other conferences or meetings that they could attend?
Yes, so annually, National Guard Bureau, we host an all hazards coordination workshop every March. And then again in November, we host the Domestic Operations Conference. And during those two events, the states are able to learn from one another and prepare for domestic response activities. So during the all hazard coordination, we actually take time to review the state's all hazards plan, and we kind of give them pointers on where they should fix, things that they can improve, things that they may want to add or take away. And it also gives them a chance to collaborate and information sharing with their other fellow state partners. And then during the domestic operation conference, that's where we're actually really trying to take a more strategic approach. So we're sharing them information that we're getting from at the higher level and how they can apply it at the state and local levels.
With all of those conferences and those strategic perspectives, are there any trends that NGB or your office has identified?
Not really. So, but one of the things that we do try to advocate during all of those conferences is the National Guard Joint Planners course that we've been hosting, probably been going on for about 5 years. But during the Joint Planners course, we bring in all of our interagency subject matter experts, and we also bring in personnel from the Office of the Secretary of Defense and some of our other federal partners, and they actually provide a course of instructions to the state personnel that come attend these classes on what they can do to improve their plan. And one of the big events of attending that course is the capstone project, is where we actually give you a scenario and we look at your state response plan for that type of scenario. And we actually give you pointers and what you can do to improve your plan, give you things to look at. You brief your plan at the end, and we bring in subject matter experts from around NGB to evaluate your plan. So you're actually taking a real world product back to the states that you can use.
So that's if there aren't any meetings going on, you can attend that course.
Yes.
So how often is it held, and how do I get into that course if I wanted to?
Right. So the course is taught twice a year. We typically try to teach it in January. We do, and again in August, sometime one in the winter, one in the summer. And the course is offered through ATARS, but it is a joint course. Right now, we're trying to figure out really how to get into the air training education system. But for right now, ATARS for all of the Army personnel. And through the air side, you can just email the POC for the course is a Major Leroy Alvaranga, and he can help with enrollment. We do cap the class at about 30 people. But once you're into the course, it is a well-taught course. You're getting to interact with all of the subject matter experts from all of the various agencies that we partner with. And we are giving you the tools and a lot of the information that you can use that'll help you be a better planner an action officer for all of those domestic incidents that your state may be called to respond to.
If a leader wanted to send someone to the course, are there any rank requirements or anything that you look for particularly in students?
No rank requirements at all. We just want you to come out and get the tools you need to be trained.
Okay, yes, ma'am. So as we come to the end of the podcast, one question that we always ask is, within your organization, with the sense of leader development, what advice would you give to people within your own organization?
The biggest advice that I will give, and it's a common echoing theme for me, is always about relationship building. I always try to treat people with dignity and respect, and I always try to show outstanding customer service. Because when you present yourself as an eager and willing participant and you're doing that active communication, it actually goes a long way with building relationship and building that partnership that you're looking to build. And another thing that I always try to tell my personnel, although we are still living in a COVID environment to where a lot of the things that we operate on are in the virtual realm, don't be afraid of virtual collaboration tools, because those tools still allow you to have that one-on-one interaction with your peers. You can turn on the camera, turn off the camera, but it's allowing you the opportunity to actually have those verbal conversations that sometimes get lost because we are operating in such an austere environment. But if we're doing those daily interactions through those virtual collaboration tools, we're still maintaining and building those relationships. And we're not just solely relying on email
Yes,
to
ma'am.
interact. So,
Yes, ma'am. And the final question that we have is, if it's very open-ended, if you could go back 15 years, what advice would you give yourself?
I could give myself Lieutenant Williams some advice. It would be, don't be risk averse. Growing up, we learned to always shy away from the hard assignments and to not always run to the problem. Being risk averse is something that is kind of being taught in a different way. You should be that person always willing to go out, try new things. Don't be afraid to challenge yourself. Because when you open yourself and you try new experiences, that's when you usually surprise yourself and you learn that you are actually more capable of doing those things that you may not have thought you were designed to do.
So if you're scared of something, dive in.
Dive in.
Okay.
Feet first. All in.
Yes, ma'am. Alrighty. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, and we've really appreciated all of your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, ma'am.
Take care.
If you would like more information on any of the topics that we discussed today, please visit our social media pages in the links below. If you liked today's episode, please don't forget to subscribe and leave us a 5-star review. You can find us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.